I am a last-minute step-in for Gudrun Wells. I note she is one of our CTIQ research officers who's really been heading up this project. And unfortunately, due to some Qantas delays, she's now mid-air at the time that she was going to be presenting this. So I do apologise for any errors in the way that this comes across. I'll do my best to represent her accurately and very clear at the outset that all credit goes to Gudrun and all errors are attributable to me. I'm just going to try and change what I'm seeing so that I can see the presenter notes. I'm not sure if that's going to be possible. Potentially not. Okay, that's all right. We will just do the best that we can. And again, please, bear with me. What I'm going to be talking about with you today is one of our CTIQ projects that is a partnership here with the VCCC Alliance. And what we set out to look at was how do we, as a research community, go about engaging with our participants through their clinical research journey. And some of this really came about as a follow-on from a CTIQ project that we spoke a little bit about in one of the sessions or a couple of the sessions yesterday at this symposium. As some of you are aware, CTIQ did a lot of work in the last couple of years looking at informed consent and particularly developing a revised participant information and consent form that is currently in beta testing, where we spend a lot of time talking about what should be in the consent form, what's meaningful for participants to have as information, what might be extraneous, how can we make it as clear and concise as possible, all incredibly important things. But a conversation that we kept coming back to as a project team and as CTIQ is, isn't it ridiculous in some ways that we spend so much time focusing on this one moment of informed consent when actually people are often in these research projects for really long periods of time? They might be there for a few weeks, but often it's a few months. And for oncology trials and some other kinds of trials, it can be years or a lifetime that people are actually involved in these research projects. And we started talking about whether there was a way that we could also think about how people engage with research throughout that journey, not just at the moment of time that is really focused upon in that important, but one moment in time, informed consent. And at CTIQ, we really pride ourselves on centering consumers in the work that we do. And so I wanted to put up a quote here from one of the consumers who was a member of the Informed project team, the ones redeveloping participant information and consent forms, who also was in some ways the instigator of this project and a project team member on this project Beyond the Form. This is Sarah Lukeman. Now, Sarah, for any of you who've met her, is an absolute powerhouse and speaks very openly and very directly about her experience of being in a leukemia trial. She directly credits this leukemia trial as saving her life, but also notes some of the challenges that she experienced while on this trial. And you see the quote from her, she is saying that, she was in this trial for 2.5 years. But in the last couple of years, she was really isolated. She was doing oral chemotherapy at home where she was also looking after 2 young kids. And it easily becomes a really isolating experience. And Sarah challenged us to think about what are the ways that we work with participants and researchers through that journey to make sure that people continue to feel valued and engaged and respected. Which leads us to the Beyond the Form project. You can see here the high-level goals of the project, as well as the main pieces of work that the project team is engaging in to try and lead at the finalisation of the project to a toolkit. We started with a white paper that we contracted to independent researchers to do a rapid review of the peer-reviewed and grey literature to work out what is already out there in terms of engagement and communication strategies with participants. In particular, what is out there where these engagement or communication strategies have actually been assessed, where there's been some kind of evaluation of how they've worked. What became really clear was there's not that much out there, particularly from an Australian perspective, of the benefits and drawbacks of doing communication work. What I'm going to be really focusing on in this presentation is the second piece of work that CTIQ and the VCCC Alliance took on, which is looking at researcher experiences, both through a survey and through that interviews with people working in research. So both people working as investigators as well as clinical research coordinators and some sponsor representatives as well. Our next piece of work that is really going to be happening early next year, some of it is happening now, mostly early next year, to talk with participants, people who've previously been in a clinical research project, about what communication is relevant for them. Of the strategies we've heard so far, what resonates as being valuable, what might come across as tokenistic or less valuable, and are there other ideas for communication and engagement that we haven't heard from researchers or from the literature that through their lived experience are things that we as a community should be considering more actively? That will lead us to a stakeholder workshop next year where we bring together all the parts of the clinical research sector, including researchers, consumers, HRECs, and sponsors, to evaluate what we've heard and think about what would be practical and feasible for the community moving forward. And all of that will feed into a final toolkit that will be made available through the CTIQ website and free to use for anyone in the community who chooses to do so. Shout out to the Beyond the Form team. For those of you who are aware of CTIQ, we're relatively small in terms of our internal capacity, but we stand on the shoulders of giants of having really active involvement from all of our member organisations. And you can see here the members who are active in this particular CTIQ project, as well as our really valued consumer team members who have collectively really kept us on track for making sure that everything that we're doing is going to be valued by our consumer group. One thing I am realising, as I haven't had my notes in front of me, is I haven't yet acknowledged the country that I'm on. I do want to acknowledge that I have the privilege of living and working in Lutruwita in Hobart on the land of the Muwininya people, and I do want to pay my respects to their elders, as well as the emerging Tasmanian Aboriginal community, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are in this presentation today. So thank you so much for continuing to care for country and for the honour of living and working on the beautiful land that I do. So let's move on now to the guts of what I want to talk about with you today, which is the work that CTIQ and the VCCC Alliance did to talk with the research community about their communication and engagement strategies. We conducted 20 interviews through August and October of this year that then we have done a positivist analysis of to draw out themes and trends. You can see there the main questions that we covered. Most of these interviews took somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes, and we talked with people in a semi-structured way about their background, their role and research activities, what kinds of participants they tended to work with. Were they particularly looking at paediatric or oncology or cardiovascular trials? And what was the implications of that for the kinds of communication strategies that they employed and prioritised with their participant groups? how well do they think they're doing in terms of communicating with their participants, and what are the reasons why they are doing that well, or the barriers in their way for being able to do a better job of that? And finally, what are their ideas for improving the communication that is currently done, whether that be incremental steps or whether that actually be sweeping changes to how we think about engaging with participants throughout this journey of clinical research. You can see there's some general metrics for who we spoke to. Probably the biggest things to point out are the large numbers of study coordinators who we spoke to. That was simply based on who had the interest to get in touch with us and say that they wanted to participate. We tried very hard to get a diverse snapshot, including bringing in regional voices and voices not just in the Eastern Seaboard. Probably reflective of the research that's done in these areas was the large number of oncology trialists and coordinators that we spoke to. Also, the fact that we have VCCC Alliance as a partner, so prioritising those oncology voices was, partly to do with the networks we were drawing upon. But we did speak to people working in quite a diverse array of research fields, including genetics, neurology, endocrine, infection, reproductive health, and so forth. The majority of people that we spoke to were people who'd been working in human subject research for quite a long time, many of them for more than 5 years, and the vast majority for more than 5 years. After a positivist analysis of the interview transcripts, we came up with 4 broad categories in terms of what topics came up in discussion, leading to 10 overarching themes. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, but I'll particularly focus on this second category, designing for successful communication, because that was the one where we heard most about the HREC and governance role. So, first one here, knowing your participants. What was really clear in the discussions that we had were how important it was for communication to really think in a nuanced way about who your participants are and what they need out of communication. So some people we spoke to, particularly researchers working in oncology trials, were really saying, look, our people are really motivated to continue in the trial and to speak to us about the trial because they're sick and this is their chance of treatment. And so actually, honestly, we don't have to work very hard because they're really, really motivated to be here with us. For other people that we spoke to, that was much more of a challenge in terms of retention, and they needed to think really thoughtfully about how engagement should work. Sometimes that was because it was in the context of pediatric studies where the people that were being communicated with, so parents typically for younger studies with younger kids, had a different relationship to the study team. Often these were people who were really time pressed. We heard some people say, for example, we can't have communication strategies that are going to rely on a password and a login. That's just too much of a barrier. These people are busy. They're already caring for sick kids. And we need communication that is about a hard copy piece of paper that I can write on and give to them face to face, because otherwise it's simply never going to be opened and read. Then there were people who were working with older minors, so teenagers predominantly, who said, look, what we have is social media. Our participants told us that what they really wanted to see was us doing videos on TikTok. And so it's not really our natural space. It's not something we as a research team felt overly comfortable with, but we did our research and we did our utmost to provide information to people in the form that they are most wanting to use, which what we were told was TikTok for this particular study group. And so our message from this is you need to know your participants. You need to know their motivations and how those characteristics and motivations are going to impact the effectiveness of different communication strategies. The flip side of that was knowing barriers. What are the barriers in terms of the timing of phone calls? And we heard from many people that they use texts instead of phone calls because people respond to a text in a way that they're not going to pick up the phone, particularly if it is a phone call coming from a number that isn't already in their contact list. We heard concerns from some people about familiarity with technology, that if communication strategies were bound up with all-in-one websites, while there were some really impressive things that you could do with those websites, there were barriers for some participants in using them. The care research interface, a lot of people, when we talked about how do you go about communicating with your participants, really spoke about quite nuanced strategies that the study team had for working alongside a clinical care team, often because they were co-located in the same hospital. They might have access to electronic medical records to know if a participant was going to be in the hospital for a care-related reason, and using that as opportunities to serendipitously check in and say hello, and continue to develop rapport. We also heard about use of those electronic medical records as a check before ringing someone to say, be able to see, have they progressed? Should we be thinking about whether to contact them? Are there adverse events we should be aware of as a study team that will impact the way that we might choose to ring them, comments that we should make when we're ringing them, and so forth. And so we heard a lot about this care research interface and how it should play out. Then we heard what we've labelled effective communication, some really tangible strategies in terms of how people go about using technology and other tools to communicate well. And this is where we got some of the really strategic communication ideas that we want to really test out with consumers next year and past participants next year to see what they thought about communication that we heard, as well as the purpose behind the communication. Do they see it the same way that the research community does? And so here, for example, we have people saying, you know what, texts are our best means of communication. Trying to call someone, they don't have time, they're going to be working, perhaps they're on a school teacher or on a building site. We don't want to call them out of the blue. It's not respectful of their time. If we can send them a text, they can see it really quickly, they can answer it easily, it's taking less of their time, and they're more likely to be able to engage with it. Other people spoke a lot about having open lines of communication, having a dedicated phone number that participants could ring at times of their choosing, to have this continual discussion, to actively encourage our participants to get in touch with the study team and to tell us what they thought. I didn't really mean to go to the next slide, but this is the main one that I wanted to focus on with all of you, because a lot of what we heard when we talked about enablers and barriers came to this demarcation of roles and responsibilities when it comes to communicating with participants, and the challenges that that demarcation can have for people that want to be adaptive in their communication styles. One of the initial challenges was how the protocol itself was set up. Are you jumping in to give me a time?
Yes.
How long do I have?
About a minute.
About a minute. Okay. So what I think is really interesting here is the different ways people thought of the HREC role. Some people said, we chat with our HREC all the time. It helps us do our research. If we need an amendment, we pop it in, and generally it happens really easily. Some others said, well, we can't communicate with our participants the way we want, because then we'd have to put in an amendment, and that's going to take ages and it's going to be really clunky. And that difference in style in the way that researchers thought about HRECs, as well as the way they thought about proactively engaging with sponsors in the design of the protocol, was really telling and interesting, and something we want to draw out. Okay, I've already spoken about next steps, and Hudson's jumped in to give me a time warning. So I'll leave it up there with the QR codes in case anyone wants to get involved, and we'll pass back over to Hudson.